Good evening. Good evening, everyone. For those of you that I have not met, I'm Reverend Dr. Anna Copeland, the senior minister of this community church of Vero Beach, and we're truly grateful that you have made your way here this evening, and we hope that you will find this as rich an experience as we are anticipating we have been for some time. This is an exciting time for us. This is the second Ohl Lectureship that we've had this year that was established in 2019 to annually bring nationally known speakers to educate and stimulate and motivate people who are focused on leadership. And tonight we're focused on theological leadership, how we can be creating hope in anxious times through our faith. And the focus of this lectureship is for leadership in ethics and public service also through this church. The idea of this series began with Ron and Joan Ohl in 2016 while they were attending another lecture. And the Ohls developed the idea with church leadership. And when Ron passed to glory in 2017, the Ohl Lecture Fund was established to carry forward the Ohl legacy. So this is an event tonight that we are anticipating will continue for a long time. And Joan, would you stand tonight so we can recognize and thank you for your generosity? You can read the fullness of Joan's bio in your program tonight. If you didn't get one, please get one on the way out. And also Ron, who was so committed to education and through her government service in the Bush administration White House and his leadership both in the academy and in higher education and also through the church, he has impacted and mentored the lives of hundreds of young people, and this honors him so profoundly. So thank you so much. Tonight we're going to be welcoming Miroslav Volf, and we've been reading his work here for some time. We've been reading different works. Some of us have been reading For the Life of the World, Theology That Makes a Difference. We also have spent quite a bit of time talking in the last year and a half about what is the purpose of our life. So others have been drawn to Life Worth Living, a guide to what matters most. And this is really helpful to, we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then Free of Charge is about giving and forgiving in a culture stripped of grace. This is a very special book that I've enjoyed so very much. It's one of, I can't remember what year this was published, Miroslav. It should be 2006. This is one of the former works, but people are still being moved and changed by this one. And then Exclusion and Embrace, which is the first time I heard from you when a group of my colleagues actually met with you at Yale, and I couldn't make that trip, so I missed out, or I would have met you a long time ago. Winner of the 2002 Louisville Grawemeyer Award in Religion. So I wanted to just say a word before I introduce Miroslav tonight. As we've talked on the phone, I've written notes in the margins of the book. And I was especially moved by the series of questions about why our faith matters today. And he asked a series of questions that I want to just cue up for a moment. Who is Jesus Christ for us today? What is the nature of a flourishing life? How am I supposed to act in the world in these times? What kind of circumstances do I require? And how does a good life feel? These are really profound questions for us, and I know that Jesus was asked over 300 questions, and he only answered a very few. He just helped us ask better questions, and so do you. I'm really grateful for that. Miroslav is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School and the founder and director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And tonight I want to introduce Bill Cross, who is here from Massachusetts, the chair of the board. Bill, where are you? Welcome. We're so grateful that you could come tonight and be with us, and thank you for all that you do to bring these conversations, these meaningful conversations, to places like ours. And I also want to introduce one of the board members for the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, Julie Johnson. Julie, thank you. Would you stand also? She's here with her husband, Doug, tonight. We're grateful for you. She has been hosting Miroslav this week as we've invited him to come for some respite and renewal, which is why many of us come to Florida. Miroslav was educated in his native Croatia and the United States and Germany, earning his doctoral and postdoctoral degrees with highest honors from the University of Tübingen, Germany. He's written more than 20 books, over 100 scholarly articles, and his work has been featured in the Washington Post, Christianity Today, Sojourners, and several other outlets, including NPR, On Being with Krista Tippett, and public television's Religion and Ethics News Weekly. I'll let you read the rest of that bio. It's in your material, so you'll be able to take that with you. So it is just truly a great gift and honor tonight to be able to welcome you, and thank you for taking time to come south out of the cold of the Northeast at the moment to be with us. Welcome. Please join me. Welcome.
It's not very hard. Do you hear me? It's not very hard to entice person, obviously from north, to come down south. Look at all of you here. It's really great to be here. And as I was reflecting about my different visits to Florida, I think it's the first time that I actually came and spent day on Florida's beaches, which is kind of a crazy thing, but it is a reality. I had a wonderful walk today, and half walk, half jog on the beach, and it was great. It's very good to be here. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me, and Julie for preparing this. It's also a pleasure to be here celebrating 100th anniversary of that church. Churches are, I think, very important institutions. And I grew up as a kid of a minister, and when I was teenager, I thought my father was wasting his time. But as I matured just a little bit, I realized what an incredibly important work is being done, being with people as they live their lives, accompanying people and kind of leading them into what one might describe as a true life. That's the aspiration. And as I was thinking about the church and the true life, I was reminded, especially yesterday, came to my mind while we were experiencing the eclipse. Not so much here, but up north, which I missed traveling down here. People were totally fascinated. The world was fascinating. I follow news through BBC. It was front page news right there on BBC that there is this phenomenon that is happening of the moon occluding the light of the sun. I then remembered that early church fathers, they had an image for the church. And they said that the church is a moon, or like a moon, that does not have a light of its own, but all the light that it has is a reflected light, and it's a light of Christ that it reflects and shines into the world. And I always thought this was such an important image of the church. Churches do many other things. And many things to kind of nurture the communities. But I think at the heart of all of this is the presence of Jesus Christ and the light that he has brought into the world. And Anna mentioned that one of the important questions for me is the question that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, some of you have heard that name, who was a theologian, who was then imprisoned toward the end of his life in Nazi Germany for an attempt to participate in assassinating Hitler. But while he was in prison, and he lost his life there, he then wrote famous letters and papers from prison. If some of you want a little bit of reading, interesting reading, that might be something you want to read. But the central question that he raised in this text was, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And I think that is for the church, continuation of the life of the church. That is the fundamental question. And that will also in many ways determine how we position ourselves in the world, in the situation in which we find ourselves today. And it's about this situation of the world today that I want to talk a little bit. And what I'm going to do is first sketch just a tiny bit of problem of living in dark times, of anxiety, and then offer 3 short kind of vignettes or the ways in which we can find our way possible, start to find our way possible out of the darkness in which we sometimes more think than in actuality are. The thing that we are than in actuality we than we actually are. Okay. Now, some of you have probably seen or read the book by Jonathan Haidt, Anxious Generation. And it's in addressing the problem that Generation Z and a little bit of Generation Alpha. Generation Z is, I think it starts in born 97 through 2012, and Gen Z come afterward, that they are a very anxious generation, and partly anxious because they're constantly on the social media. You know the problem, it has been mentioned many times, and he suggests ways in which we can go out of that anxiousness. But you have the similar, slightly different phenomenon of anxiousness with millennials, who are kind of a generation prior to that. Just this past weekend, on Friday and Saturday, I have organized at Yale a very small conference on pessimism. Because pessimism is what we, it's a mood of the time, and we did studied kind of for that famous pessimist philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer. You want to read on pessimism? Read Arthur Schopenhauer. He's going to tell you how it's absolutely not worth living. And it would have been better had each one of us not been born. Because there's, no matter what you do, you can't escape kind of negativity of the very fabric of your life. Now, you can't get more pessimistic than that. That's not because of circumstances around, right? That's because the very nature of our being. So we are studying this, right? at this conference. And prior to that, a colleague of mine who helped me organize that, he said, well, look what I saw on Reddit. There's somebody posted, some millennial, how this world is so terrible, I just can't bring myself to bring children into the world. And then he scrolls on the thread, and pages upon pages of all similar claims by millennials, how this isn't a place where one could ever think about bringing actually children because it's such a terrible place. Then, of course, those of us who are a little bit older, boomers and silent generation, we look at these and we think, what's happening with our younger folks, that they read the world in such ways? Where have we landed, and why? Because for many reasons, the world in which we live now is a better world than the world that we lived in the 50s, and yet we don't feel, most people do not feel that that is the case. So what do we do in this kind of anxious age? I want to suggest that one more kind of reason, if you want, for anxiousness that we have, and that is, this is how I started thinking about it, namely that there is a sense in which we live in a world that is dying. One form of the world is passing. Another form of the world has not yet been born. We live in between times. And I think some of the most obvious places where you can see that is emergence of generative artificial intelligence, where we don't really know what is going to happen. Processes are underway which will transform the world in major ways, in ways that other technologies have not. And I think there are other phenomena of this kind which make it almost palpably, feel it almost palpably, that we live in a kind of dangerous times. We don't know what is going to happen with our world. Now, what's more difficult even is that we lack resources in order to live in a responsible way, in a way that is not self-destructive in a world of that nature. And I want to offer at least some reasons why we feel that way and how we might be able to get out of it. Now, this is very ambitious to think that I can, in a matter of 30 minutes or maybe less, suggest the way out of the malaise that in which the entire world is gripped. And I don't have these kinds of ambitions, but at least I want to set you on certain train of thinking and see whether the things that I'm reflecting about might not, in fact, help. So why do we feel so disoriented? And why do we find it hard to be hopeful? I think one reason I would want to suggest is that this is a step removed from a problem, and I'll get to it very soon. One reason is that we think that we know what we want, but we rarely think about what is worth wanting. We think we know what we want, but we rarely think about what is truly worth wanting. So each of us naturally generates all sorts of desires. We want this, we want that. And normally those desires are desires that have been formed by us looking over the shoulder back to the yard across the fence, seeing what our neighbors do, looking on mass media, and kind of figuring out what everybody wants, and so we will want what kind of everybody wants, but have actually never checked those wants against what we have reasonably decided that is truly worth wanting. And in children, in our young people, that expresses itself that one has dreams. So if you talk to your teenager and you want to figure out what they should aspire to be, then you might look at what they're good at, there's been good responses to what they were doing, what they're a little passionate about it, and then finally you would say, but just make sure to follow your dream. Everything else you can bracket, but your dream you cannot. If you betray your dream, you're going to betray yourself, and so the dream kind of dominates this orienting wish that we have. Now, as it turns out, we know that these dreams do not last very long. They shift and change. We've lived long enough to know that. And if you look very carefully at those dreams, they seem to be strangely similar to each other. Each is unique, authentically my own, and every dream looks alike somebody else's dream, right? So it hasn't been so much deeply reflected as kind of intuitively felt. Sometimes it's because we have this idea of our authenticity. And notion of authenticity is roughly this. You and I are like an onion. You peel, and then you're supposed to find the kernel of your self there, and that kernel you're supposed to be, except that we are like an onion, and you can peel all the way through, and when you finally peel the last one, there's nothing left inside, right? because we don't have some kind of depth here that is uniquely ours. And it's our mistake that we think that we have. And so what has been actually learned from outside, we kind of deem to be authentically our own. So now if you have your changing dreams, what do you require then to be able to live and succeed in the world? You need resources. You need means. Variety of means in order, when your dreams change, you will be able to satisfy those dreams. So you need know-how, capital. You need economic capital. You need reputational capital. You need aesthetic capital. You need to be able to present yourself when you speak to one person or another, otherwise you will not succeed in the world. All these forms of capital are means, and they're means for what? In order to get from point A to point B. Now, most of our education these days, most of our thinking these days, is oriented around finding means to get from point A to point B. Point B is what we want. Point A is what we need where we are. But it turns out that those means are tricky things. Because means, when you pursue them, have a tendency to become ends and goals. Money is absolutely the best example for that. Money is a consummate means. That's why we value it. In fact, money has absolutely no worth in and of itself. It's worth nothing. Entirety of the worth of money is being a potent means. And just because it is such, suddenly pursuing means, we end up, in order to achieve ends, we end up pursuing those means. We want to have more and more of it, as if it were not a means, as if it was an end. So it is, I hate to disappoint you, with knowledge, with education. I'm a professor, I should know, right? You simply want to do more, right? And want to have more citation of your work. So logic of increase is always there. But so it is also when I go to my gym. Often there are people who spend a very short amount of time just to get enough. There are a lot of people who don't go to the gym, and I have nothing against that. But some who go, there is a kind of obsession that develops, and the exercise becomes the goal in and of itself that dominates. Means tend to become our ends. And a friend of mine who's a sociologist in Germany, he said modern humans, they resemble a painter who is constantly obsessing about his studio, her studio, how the light is coming, whether there's sufficient light, whether the materials are good, paints and paint brushes, whether climatic conditions are right, so much so that she never gets to paint. So you've got the painter who doesn't paint. And in this image of painter who is obsessing with means, he sees expressed, my friend, sociologist, he sees expressed who we are as modern human beings, obsessed with means, but unable to know what our ends are like. And then we find ourselves in a little hamster wheel of means. And we run through our hamster wheel, and then you ask yourself, what's the purpose of this? What is the end goal of this? Recently I was talking about hamster wheel, and a little bit critical of us being in a hamster wheel, and somebody who just got retired said, but I love my hamster wheel. I could empathize. Kind of the routine of doing what you were doing, even if there is no particular grand purpose on it, but it organizes your life. And yet, very few people can imagine either individual life or a society in the image of a hamster wheel. So what is worth wanting what is worth loving is one of the fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves. In what is it worth investing our time and energies? What is it that remains? What is this that gives us truly satisfied lives? And this is a question we can ask when we are young. It's a question that we can ask at any stage of our lives. Never too late and always important. Now, this lack of knowledge of what is truly worth wanting has an interesting consequence, or is tied to an interesting phenomenon. And here's my second point that I want to make. We tend not to pursue what is excellent, but seek to be better than others. We pursue superiority over others rather than excellence in and of itself. That is something that is truly excellent, that is truly worth wanting, truly worth desiring, but rather we determine what we will pursue in comparative relationship to others. That's our neighbor. What our neighbor has, that becomes important. For me, I drive my nice little Honda Fit, and then my neighbor parks next to me a nice Audi e-tron, and I think, whereas before he had his Audi e-tron, I was quite pleased with my little car. Did its service quite well, and suddenly this e-tron has diminished the value of my car by the sheer fact of its existence next to me. And I think that somehow is not quite right. That cannot be right? That overnight, in a matter of 5 minutes, that I saw that other car, the value of my own car has changed for me, and yet it happens all the time. And this kind of striving to be somehow better, at least as good as others, but it doesn't help you that if you are just as good as others, you get to be just a little bit better, right? Then the satisfaction comes, right? And then you are kind of feel good about yourself until you start not feeling good about yourself because somebody else has had something else, and then you are constantly in an experience the inner dissatisfaction of striving for comparative values. One example that is very, very interesting. This past summer, my wife and I were on a trip in Aegean, and it was started in Istanbul, and we were following, sailing in the footsteps of Apostle Paul. But we stopped in Istanbul and then went there to Hagia Sophia, which is the great cathedral there, which has been turned now into a mosque. And then our guide is telling us about building of it. And Justinian, the emperor in the 6th century, has built this marvelous structure, but he's built it because he was competing with Juliana, very rich a woman of Roman heritage who has built the church, and he didn't have church as good as Juliana's was. He tried to get Juliana to give him some money because she was really rich, and she decided she wouldn't. And what she did with that money, she melted all the gold and put it into the inner ceiling of her church. And so her church looked magnificent, and of course he couldn't complain because she was giving the church to God, the money to God, right? But he was left without. So he decided he's going to build a marvelous church. In the course of I think 7 years, he builds this structure that is absolutely stunningly magnificent. So when it's done, and he watches it like a hawk, so that it succeeds. Best architects, everything, but at the pace that was really actually unsustainable architecturally. So he when it was open, the doors were open and he could enter, he rushes in. That's apocryphal, but probably something close of it is true. He rushes in, falls on his knees, and says, "Solomon, I have beat you." He was competing not just with Juliana, he was competing with King Solomon, who has built this marvelous temple, who has built it, and Justinian built his temple that is about, I think, 10 times larger than Solomon's, and built it in shorter period of time than Solomon. And it was architectural actually marvel. So he was competing now with the grandest temple in the Hebrew Bible or in the biblical text that he knew as being present. So it goes. So it goes at the level of Justinian, and so it goes at the level of Miroslav and his Honda Fit, right? So it goes in most of our lives, and the consequence of that is that I already mentioned a kind of a permanent dissatisfaction with the state in which we are and the state of things that we have. Things are not beautiful, important as things. They're important as indicators of my status in relationship to other people. That's why this devaluation happens. It has nothing to do with things. Things are not significant as such. They're significant to us then because they give us a certain position vis-a-vis other people. Very good example of that you can see. I don't know how many of you have read Milton's Paradise Lost. I've been reading it recently and was completely enamored. It takes you a while to read Milton's language because it's a little bit difficult. It's poetic and doesn't come from our period. But once you get over the initial hurdle, it's an extraordinary piece of writing. Now, he's got there Satan in that Paradise Lost. And Satan is competing. We've encountered him competing with God. He's second. And the curse of being second in these competitive relationships, right? In Olympic Games or whatever competitions, being third is great, right? You're standing on the podium. Being second is awful. And the reason is because we are interested in our comparative standing, and the third one compares themselves with the rest of the crowd who isn't on the podium, but the second one compares himself with the one who isn't in the middle, right? And the whole dynamics of the kind of spoiling of the rebellion against God and then spoiling of the earth begins with this competitive relationship of Satan with God. That's why rebellion is there, and he is rebelling even though he knows that he cannot win. It becomes so irrational, that need to be better than somebody else. But where I was going with it, its most interesting thing to me was when he was conquered by God, when he's now thrown down into the pit because his rebellion did not succeed, he sees that God created a world. And then we have at one moment Satan observing the world. And Milton writes, with all delights that he saw before him, undelighted. Something absolutely splendid before him. And he kind of knows that it's splendid, and yet he cannot delight in it. That too, kind of competitive relationships do. Then, of course, we have aggressive competitive relationships that then try to, as in case of Satan or others, that try to undermine whatever else anybody is doing. We live in a world this is not right to say that we live in the world. I am the world of these competitive relationships. And when I observe some of my students, wonderfully smart students, but they're comparing themselves with other Yale students. They're comparing themselves with others, and they feel depressed about their own inadequacy. There must be something wrong about the way in which we go about establishing value of our own lives. That somebody who is so gifted, so smart, sees themselves as completely inadequate, that they can be actually become incapacitated by depression. How many of us are experiencing just that? Beautiful. If you took us out of the context in which we are, beautiful. Put us back where we are and we start comparing ourselves. And that's why we are so harsh on ourselves. And I sometimes think that a kind of pessimism that we see about the world is pessimism that we often first see in our own toward ourselves. And often people say that it begins, the sense of kind of arrogance, comparisons with others and striving begins with certain sense of self-loathing. How do we discover the beauty of the self? How do we discover, my previous question was, that which is truly worth aspiring for, that is really truly worth wanting? I come to the third point. We don't know how to love well and what to love. We don't know how to love sufficiently ourselves, not to compare ourselves with others. I think we have somehow unlearned what it means to hope. So my last point is about hope. Now, what is hope? When you come to think about it, it's not quite clear what hope is. But generally, we think of hope and associate hope with optimism. If we are optimistic about what might happen, then we think of ourselves as hopeful. If we're pessimistic, then we think of ourselves as unhopeful. And often, optimism and pessimism, they can be features of our character. We know that some of us are tending to see proverbial glass half full, some of them tend to see it half empty. So they're kind of dispositional optimists and pessimists. But optimism is also sometimes connected with what one might describe as extrapolative thinking, which is to say, okay, I look at the situation now, I look at the patterns, like a weatherman does, right? We look what has transpired and what is now, and from there we draw the lines into the future, and then we can be optimistic or pessimistic. We can state expectations in terms of a positive or negative expectation. Future, in other words, we say to ourselves, and many of us feel it in our bones, the future is born out of the past and present. Or, put it differently, present is always pregnant with the future. And so that the future ends up being extension of the present into the future. Now, in Bible, in biblical tradition, hope is something very different. I've learned that from my teacher. His name is Jürgen Moltmann. He wrote a book, Theology of Hope. Some of you may know that. And actually that book, in the 60s, when it was published, brought him on the cover of the New York Times. Because it was so important. Of course, that was a kind of a Kennedy era, right? It was a time of kind of optimism, right? But I think that folks who put him there on the New York Times front page didn't quite understand what he was after, because he was pushing against the idea that hope is what we can conclude will happen in the future, based on what we can conclude will happen in the future on the basis of what's happening today. He thought that the images of hope in the Bible are Abraham and Sarah. In the book of Romans, you have Abraham and Sarah. They have been promised that they will have a child. But how old are they? Way too, a little bit older than I am. And there just is not, there is no possibility for the present. Anything with which Sarah is pregnant at present will not be a child in 9 months, right? That just isn't going to happen. And so Moltmann's idea was that hope in the biblical tradition is based not on what is, but on what God has promised. It opens up the space in our causal nexus of causal relationships for something new to happen. Is it possible that something new can happen, so that the life doesn't just run its own deterministic course, but new states of affairs, new forms of life emerge? And this is what in biblical tradition hope is. It's a kind of trust that God can bring out of darkness light, or that the light can come to shine also in the darkness. That's one feature of hope. There's another feature of hope that I think is really important. We often think of hope, I hope for something, and we say, well, I hope in what I don't see yet, right? Which is to say, I've imagined it. It's in my head. I have a clear picture of what it is that I hope. It's just not yet a reality, right? And so now I'm here, and this my image of is what's going to happen here, and my hope is I trust that this image that I have will be realized. But if you look at the way how hope works in the biblical traditions, you'll realize that doesn't work that way. You realize that there is an image, and then comes the fulfillment, and it's different than that image was. So that Martin Luther, he's one of my heroes, Protestant theologian from the 16th century, he said, hope sets you in a darkness so that you don't quite know what the result is going to be. Now, this sounds really abstract. I'll give you a concrete example. I fall in love. This is true. True example. This is what happened, right? So, and before I fall in love, I had kind of idea of what this woman that I'm going to fall in love is going to look like, who she's going to be. You know, and they're kind of, I didn't actually have checklist, you know, so that every time I go on a date, let me check like checks. But you know, whether you have actual checklist or is that this checklist that you kind of hold without actually spelling it completely out, it's a checklist, more or less precise, right? It's a checklist, and so you see this. But then I find myself, I fell in love. It's great. And then I look at my checklist, and you know what I say? You are what I was hoping for. Without knowing, you have been the object of hope. That is to say, the fulfillment defines the character of hope. And so, if I'm smart, I'm going to be ready for fulfillment to be different than my expectation. And to grasp the good that is being fulfilled, even though it's different than what I have imagined. And I think if we think of hope as always, well, okay, so I've signed a contract. And if I've signed contract, whatever I buy has to be exactly to specification, otherwise I'm going to sue you. Right? Now, if you think of hope in those categories, I am hoping for this. Anything that doesn't fit that fully is deficient. I mean, that's a recipe for you to become a pessimist. You're never going to be happy. I'm never going to be happy. I'm never going to be positive. I have to be ready to take a journey of surprise at the good that comes to me, rather than insisting on the form of the good as I would like it served on my plate. Now, those are 3 areas, and I'm close to finishing. I've been talking too long already. So those are 3 areas which I think if we step back and think and discover what's truly worth wanting, which of my desires is chasing after wind, that will not keep me satisfied, that I have because they have been artificially imposed upon me and do not correspond to the depth of my humanity. Which of these desires are truly worth pursuing, truly worth wanting, truly worth dedicating myself to? And if I tell myself, I don't care how I stack against somebody else on some artificial scale that has been imposed by the accident of my being where I am. Think about it. If you lived somewhere else, you would have very different desires and wants based on comparisons. So it's just so arbitrary. And yet they dominate our lives. If I can orient myself towards something that is truly excellent and forget about comparisons with others. And if I can learn how to hope, if I can learn how to trust that even in the darkness, there is a light that is coming. And then when that light comes to me, that I recognize it as light even though it doesn't exactly fit the specification that I have given to it in my imagination. I think we'd be halfway out of hopelessness. Maybe even whole way out of it if we were to take these 3 practices as we live our lives together and into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. If it's all right with you, we'll take a little bit of time for questions. And
Absolutely.
I know many of you have questions about what Miroslav has brought to us tonight about hope, and you may also have a question from one of the works that you've read. Could we entertain that as well, if something rises?
Anything.
Anything.
I can always say I don't know, And
That's right, that's right. So if you have a question, just I'm going to give you the microphone. Jen?
Thank you. I'm a retired pastor. One of the joys of being part of this congregation is that we are elderly and we are given the luxury of time and resources to reflect on hope, and it feels like it might be a very different environment than at Yale with college students. I'd like to reflect on that. What could be helpful for us as a retirement congregation to think about hope? And the second thing, is this an American phenomenon? You're a world traveler, and is this an American phenomenon? This feeling of insecurity and chaos and anxiety. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the second question is easier for me to answer. I don't think it's typically American phenomenon. I think that it may be a little bit more pronounced in the States. This nation is incurably optimistic, which is a beautiful feature of United States of America. But it's actually disappointments happen against the backdrop of high expectations. And so that oscillation between high hopes and jeremiads about how things are today are not accidental. That is the same in our own lives, the perfectionists among us. It's hard for us, those of us who are perfectionists, in order to be quote-unquote satisfied. We'll be more disappointed, more pessimistic often about the situation. So I think, and it is a lesson in this relativity, if you want, of optimism and pessimism, and how they move from one to the other. That's maybe there's a lesson there, a certain sense of contentment to nurture, right? So that joy doesn't come simply from the betterment that ensues, but that the joy comes also, even if that betterment is excellent, but that the joy comes from the sheer fact of things being what they are. One of the lines I love from Dante's Paradiso, Divine Comedy. Very early in Paradiso, he goes through these stages toward kind of pinnacle, which is God, and then comes to the souls that are the lowest rung in heaven. And he's kind of puzzled. How can you be in heaven and be of lowest rung and be satisfied? It just doesn't. Who's satisfied being at the bottom? How can you be satisfied in heaven being at the bottom, right? And you think you might be satisfied just that you've made it, right? But then you compare yourself, and then and this guy's driving Audi e-tron, and then so he asks, how come? Here's the answer. We long for what we have. We long for what we have. I think in best of our relationships to things, having is not simply it being there. Having is you having a relationship of affirmation and of longing for, desiring that which you have. I have a daughter, and you know how it's with daughters and fathers. I mean, she's there, right? But I long for her when I see her. I don't long for her when I'm just away. Because that is what it means to be in a positive relationship to the good that is present to us. If you don't long for it, you're going to become indifferent to it. It's going to disappear for you from the state of being desirable. It's just going to be standing there. And so I think nurturing this sense of longing for what we have is such a beautiful thing. You'll always work hard. You have, sometimes I think of it this way. 6 days you should work, 1 day you should not just rest. You should delight in what is there.
Who else has a question?
Thank you I said don't think I've ever enjoyed a lecture as much as I have this, truly. And you mentioned Milton's Paradise Lost, and I want to, if you would please, I compliment him, saying this was the best lecture I've ever heard. But you talked about Milton's Paradise Lost. If you would please, I would like to know your definition or description of Satan. My son thinks that everything is satanic. Not everything, but many things today are satanic. So please, I'd like your description.
So you're wanting not Milton's account of Satan. You want my Satan? I see. Yeah. There's quite a bit of debate in. For instance, we imagine Satan as being picture Satan as a person, as some kind of combination, human and animal combination when we draw Satan, and that as such, Satan has personality, that is a person. But there's a discussion whether actually such radical evil person as Satan can have a personality, whether personality isn't the kind of a good that the Satan wouldn't have. So I don't quite know how to imagine Satan. But frankly, I don't know how to imagine God. I mean, I believe. I mean, I pray. I mean, I trust. But I don't know how to imagine God. I mean, I could always, somebody sitting there, there are 3 chairs up in heaven. One of them is a little bit higher than, like in Olympic Games. and the 3 of them are sitting on those chairs or something like that, right? And when I pray, I often have to kind of imagine that. But when I imagine God, I imagine actually as my nanny, who was she was 4 foot and 2 inches tall, was babushka, had a wart, and hair, facial hair, and I thought she was the most beautiful person on the planet, and I still imagine God like her. And it's because she was such a fountain of love and of affirmation. Beautiful. Reverse that and think of the fountains of denial, contempt, and you get to the kind of satanic mentality. So I don't know how to think about agency of Satan really well. I don't know how to think about kind of person of Satan well, but I know how to identify kind of satanic or evil forces that undermine our lives, that come in systemic forms, that come through individual agency. That's how I tend to think about it. It's not helpful.
Yes, sir.
So back on hope again. Dallas Willard, he was a philosopher at University of Southern California. He defined hope as anticipation of good. And what would your definition of hope be? And maybe including that, does that kind of align with kind of the biblical hope?
Yeah, no. I think that would be a good way to put it. I would put it a little bit stronger than anticipation. I would put it in terms of longing for the future, good, even the hope, right? Hope is this thing with feathers. Hope flies. So I don't simply anticipate it. I kind of entrust myself and move in the direction of the hoped for. So hope kind of pulls you in that sense. But I think as a two-word definition is as good as they come. Certainly is the good is the object of hope, but it's I personally think it's the good not that is indexed to my conception of it, but to actual good that may be surprising to us.
So, The Atlantic wrote an article this week about how younger generations aren't attending church as much as they used to, and how that's affected by not only our social media, as you mentioned earlier. My husband and I are millennials. And we have two children that are the next two generation in our home, an 18-year-old and an 11-year-old. But how younger people can reach out to other people to show them there is a community here. Like, what do we do? How do we get people to realize what they're missing? You know, that deeper need to connect, and not just on digital media, but as people.
Anna, this is for your question. This is beyond my pay grade.
Well,
I'm a mere theologian.
Yeah, I was thinking about how do you help someone want something different?
Yeah.
To be able to imagine that there's something different to want, a greater good than when my daughter was in high school and the girls were all lined up on a bench and they're all talking to each other through their phone instead of looking at each other. It wouldn't have occurred to them to want something different.
Yeah.
So how do you want what you can't see?
Yeah.
How do you know to want what you can't see?
Yeah, that's the situation in which we. I think not just as teenagers, as adults, everybody is in a situation, but it's particularly pronounced with social media, because it's actually designed for you not to want anything but the next kind of scroll, and that's the insidious character of it, and it seems to me that. You teach people how to like something they don't like by having them try it. That's how I learned how to eat certain foods. That I had a predilection for not liking it for whatever crazy reason, and I had to try it once and twice, and suddenly you discover, wow, there's such a thing as tastes that are growing, and tastes that you don't have but you can acquire, and when you do, then you have the complex taste, and you suddenly enjoy your, and so forth, right? I am hoping that something of that sort can happen, but then the question becomes, how does one induce sufficiently people to move in that direction? And it's a tough question, and sometimes this is also counsel of despair, but sometimes disappointments serve as inducements.
Mm-hmm.
And very often, as long as everything's running smoothly, kind of there's an inertia. We are like that, certainly our children are like that. A kind of crisis has to occur. One has to be rocked in order to step back and ask the deeper question. All the situations that I know of actually coming to faith that were not just straight growing smoothly into it were such situations. Certainly mine was when I talked to my mother. Hers was. Her little world crumbled when she was 8 years of age, when she was separated from her grandmother, and she had to kind of rebuild the world. And in rebuilding the world, new possibilities opened themselves up, and she was able to do that. And so it is in our lives. That's why I think that the crises of life are not. I don't wish them on myself or on anybody, but they're not to be despised. They're to be a kind of attended with care and let them become the opportunities. And maybe for those of us who accompany them to be attuned and to be wise how the crisis can be turned into opportunity.
I have a question related to that, and then I'll come back to you in just a moment. When you and I spoke recently by Zoom, we talked about how for pastors and professors and resident theologians that this is a very challenging time, this election year, for us to not be pulled off into red and blue camps. And so part of our work is to always point toward what we don't yet see, a more excellent way. Can you say a little bit more about that? That's a central work for us as a church, and I'm sure it is in your setting as well.
Yeah, I think it has been for me. I have been a friend of ours. The board members will know who that is. Skip Masbach, who was on the board of the Yale Center for Hidden Culture for a while, has described me as a theologian of the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So my generally almost all of what I've done sought to make bridges rather than kind of prophetically tear down things and then leave somebody else to build. No, but you know there are different callings. Mine was to build bridges. And to me, early on, I was born in the communist Yugoslavia. My father was a minister. One had to build bridges. The fronts were really hard. And to me, it was always important to find the ground, moral ground, that isn't tied to either of the contending camps. I mean, we live in a situation, and that's not just we, in the United States. This is a phenomenon of social psychology at various levels, whether it's at political groups, religious groups. If you have situations of tension, a group will hold together. And it will be difficult for people to, even though they may agree with things on the other side, they can't say it. If they say it, they're going to betray the cause for which they seem to stand in two sides that are at war. It's like going to the enemy and affirming goodness of the enemy. I wrote this book, Exclusion and Embrace, and it was written during the war in former Yugoslavia, when Croats and Serbs and Bosniaks and Muslims were kind of at loggerheads. Nobody liked the book. Nobody liked the book. And I was a little bit surprised at the beginning, and then I realized, of course they don't like it. They were in the middle of so imagine it as a pub brawl. So I was trying to keep them apart, and they were all intent and punching each other because they had their own reasons why that was necessary. And I was taking away their enemies. They were invested in having enemies, and I was taking them away, right? And I think sometimes we are in a situation like this, in a cultural political situation in this country. There are people who are invested in enmity because certain goals can be achieved only if that enmity exists. Now, I for myself have always thought I cannot align myself fully with either of the positions. I have to have a moral standing outside, and I will, on the ad hoc basis, determine where I will belong. That has costs, obviously, but I don't see how a responsible human being, this is too strong what I'm going to say now, but I don't see how a responsible human being would do otherwise. That is to say, even if you, on the basis of moral discernment, decide to be on one side, that moral discernment have stronger value for you and for me than either of the sides. That has to govern. It doesn't mean that you want side. folks make decisions, and that I respect that. But I want us all to make a decision on the basis of independent moral standing. And then I think we can have a conversation, because there's something that's more important to us than either of the sides, and that is a certain kind of moral commitments. We can disagree on those, or we can partly agree. I think there's a movement that can happen.
That's why we pay you the big bucks, so you could come and say that and then go home. Thank you. I think you had a question here. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate you taking that on.
I think maybe you already sort of addressed it, but I'm a competitive tennis player, and I want you to address the thing about comparison. And
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to know some strategies to create some kind of reality where excellence is the thing, and not running home and telling people whether your scores were 6-love or a little bit like your car situation. But how do you get away from contextualizing comparison, I guess?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. I find for myself that it's actually a spiritual discipline almost. I have to make it a kind of a rule for myself that I'm seeking to align my behavior, and not just my behavior outwardly, but my internal feeling. Board members will know I always give that example. I came to write about this issue. One of the reasons I was going in Chicago. You go from terminal B to C. You have to go under with escalators down and the walkways. I always carry my bags and go stairs. Down and go stairs up, never do walkways. And then once I'm walking up the stairs and I observe people there on escalators, and I think of myself, I'm kind of a better specimen of humanity. because I'm carrying, I'm virtuous because I don't I burn calories, I don't burn fossil fuels, also all sorts of stuff. And then I look at myself, you idiot! How can you think like that? This is completely stupid way of looking. You have no idea why somebody might want what they do the rest of their lives. Why they might be doing what they need to do. Maybe their leg hurts or whatever the reason is. You can't do that. But that was. It took me a while before I admitted that in front of people. But that was an internal voice, right? But it's these internal voices that are probably more important to quiet and to persuade oneself that such comparisons are stupid. And in many ways, for me, what was important is realization that what I have is kind of not my own. If I think, okay, if I want to trace to me, some kind of abstract me, any of my achievements, I start tracing, and then I see all sorts of influences that have come to my life. I don't know where I begin and where other people's contribution to my life start. And then I think if I ascribe everything to myself as if I was somehow special, then I think this is just lie. It's not true. And I'm just making myself to be something that I'm not. And so I have to have a discipline of thinking about my own self in those ways and simply kind of reject it as ugly. And in sports, there are really good examples of folks like I'm told Magic Johnson Larry Bird competition was apparently very beautiful. In a sense that they were, from what I've heard, they were competing as friends, and that's beautiful, right? Or what's the name of this endurance athlete woman? No, oh, maybe. No, Caitlin Clark, I know. No, the Detweiler or something like that, 120 miles or so. She's known on the circuit that everybody loves her. and she never compares herself with, she's absolutely the best, never compares herself with anybody, and simply wants to do her own best. It's amazing.
Thank you. Another question tonight? All right. Maybe this one be the last. Sally?
Thank you so much for being with us. I've been reading your book about forgiveness and the giver, and I feel that you have been given to us tonight very wonderfully. I want to ask you, I couldn't help but think while you were speaking about the early disciples and how incredible it was that they recognized what was being given to them in Jesus. And the business of being hopeful came out of their desperate crisis. As you said, I mean, there was Rome with their power and these poor Jewish people trying to survive. And in the midst came this person of no account, with no power, and they recognized in him something way beyond either side. Just what you're offering. So maybe when the young people, and I recognize what she was saying in my own young people, they all go off, as you did and I did too, as a teenager. If you just say, come and see, and let them try it out, sometimes what's placed in front of you is so incredibly important in the way of lighting up your crisis situation that you can only kneel in front of it. And it is a bridge between all sides.
Thank you, Sally.
That's really beautiful. I think also, just a small addition to what you said, everything you said I think is exactly right. It took some of them at least 3 years, and maybe longer, to go from attraction, and maybe not fully at all, to go from the attraction to kind of a deeper understanding and incorporating it in their lives. And I always think that patience with ourselves and patience with others seems to me so important, and not expecting it to happen overnight, because what this is requiring of us, what Christ is requiring of us, is a kind of almost total revaluation of our lives. There is this story which I find always very, very moving myself, or parable about this merchant who saw a pearl of great price, sold everything he had to buy that price, that pearl. And by the way, this is not just what Christ asks of us. If some of you are inclined to other religious tradition, if you follow the Buddha, similar kind of transformation will be necessary. In the book Life Worth Living, which is kind of more pluralistic, we talk about, just think about his life. It was complete turnabout. Now, it may not mean that everything that we do changes, but the kind of valuative framework with which we approach our lives changes. And that's, I think, what the biblical traditions think about Christ being the Lord. You can use different, if you're not happy with Lord, you call mistress, whatever you want. The one who sets the frame through which you see your life. And then suddenly you have resources to articulate what's truly worth wanting. If you don't have that frame, it's hard to get to it. And so this kind of initial attachment and growth into it becomes central for our lives.
Oh, thank you. And just thank you so much. I want once again to thank you, Joan, for your generosity in bringing a diversity of thought to us and the rich conversation we've had again this evening. And I want to thank the adult ministry of this church who has read your work and contemplated how we might be richer for your coming and truly are gratified for that. So thank you for those of you, first Bob Inhofe and then Mike Harvey and the rest of you on that committee and our executive minister, Jacob Kynes, and others here who have all labored for this time together tonight. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we hope that you have the respite that we promised you in luring you to Florida tomorrow for a Sabbath day. On the back of your program tonight, there are some, towards the back, there are some other events coming. We hope you'll take a look at that. We welcome you and hope you'll return for other events that we have here at your community church. We hope if you brought a book to sign, he's glad to sign it. The back of your hand, your program, whatever pleases you. He'll be around for a few minutes. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. And thank you again.